Hello, and welcome to a GSA momentum discussion in which timely topics that have gained momentum in the field of gerontology are explored. For this discussion, we will explore a very timely and important topic, and that is the significance of all vaccines for older adults during the COVID-19 era. I'm Kathy Cameron. I'm Senior Director for the Center for Healthy Aging at the National Council on Aging, and I will serve as the moderator for our panel discussion today. And I'm really excited to introduce our expert panel. First, we have Jason Karlawish, and he is with the University of Pennsylvania, Perelman School of Medicine. Second, we have Stefan Gravenstein, who is with Brown University Center for Gerontology and Healthcare Research, and Amy Walker with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. So welcome to all the speakers today. The handouts are available with biographies on the GSA conference website, as well as some suggested citations that might be useful to supplement the discussion today. And the flow for our discussion will consist of panel discussions with questions and answers by our panelists, starting broadly with areas of expertise, and then we'll talk about very specific topics relative to the vaccines available for older adults. And then we're going to open it up during the last 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. Before we get started, I'd like to thank GSK Vaccines for their support for the session. Thank you, GSK Vaccines. So let's get started with the discussion. COVID highlighted age as a potential risk factor in a way that many gerontologists have appreciated for many, many years, but the general public may not be aware. Stefan, can you tell us a bit about age-related declines in immunity generally, why they occur, and how that has been in play with COVID-19 during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to say concisely, but in sort of a big picture kind of a way. As we age, our immune system, specifically a component of our immune system that helps us remember what we're infected with, works less and less well. We call it homeostenosis. And I'll give you an example of that. So you can see here, this is a graph of people who are being tested for COVID, but in this case, they don't have COVID. And what you should see here is at the very top, this is the group that's 60 to 69 years old. Their average temperatures run hotter than the people who are 70, 79 years old, and those that are 80 and older. This is temperature on the left, and this is relative to a SARS test where they tested negative. So as we get older, we run colder. And that's also true not just for where our baseline temperatures are, but also how high our fever gets. So older people don't hit as high a fever, and that makes them harder to detect when you're using, say, a threshold screen of 39 degrees or 100 degrees or 101. Fewer than, there's 75% that'll never make it to that threshold temperature. About 50% will make it to a temperature of 99 or 37.2, 99 Fahrenheit. And that's a function in part of immune senescence. So not only do our T cells not work so well, which reduces our response to vaccines and infection, also the cytokines that those cells make when you get an infection don't kick up the temperature as much. So that's a very high level description. So like with fever, not making as many cytokines in the first place means that we have fewer symptoms when we present. But when we do get infected, those cytokines do kick up. And a feature of aging is that they kick up differently, and they also have a greater risk for having an outcome of a clot, causing heart attacks and strokes. So here on this graph, I use this to teach our medical students and residents, when your cytokines, your measures of inflammation are low, your measures of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, interleukin 1 and 6, TNF-alpha are also low. And as we age, just aging, kicks those up a bit, so our risk for clotting goes up just a little bit. You add on to that the diseases that you get as you get older, like obesity, diabetes, arthritis, and so forth. That kicks up those markers even more. and your risk for clotting is higher. That's why young people don't tend to get heart attacks and strokes too much, and older people do. And if you add infection to that, like flu, pneumonia, shingles, bladder infection, pressure sores, or COVID-19, during that time, right after infection and while virus is making copies, those cytokines max out and give you an even higher risk of heart attack and stroke. So on the left side here, you get some infection. It doesn't have to be flu. This changes these markers that increase the risk for clotting and having heart attacks and strokes. And the outcome for this is bigger than just the infection itself. It's these other things. So when you give somebody a vaccine, they don't respond as well because of immune senescence. But when they do respond and those T cells do kick in, you can prevent that kick up in the cytokines because the infection is milder or they don't get infected at all. And you can prevent a vast array of potential events. So there's some art to designing these vaccines. So as you hear about the COVID-19 vaccines that are in testing, there is specifically an interest in making sure that even old people will respond to these vaccines and can prevent not just the infection, but also these outcomes.
Jason, Stefan just told us that older adults can be more susceptible to disease and may have the most benefit from vaccines, but also that it can be difficult to get immune systems to respond robustly to boosts through vaccination. And we see immense focus on recruiting older adults into trials for COVID-19 vaccines and a focus on inclusion of older adults in clinical trials generally, particularly through the NIA Inclusion Across the Lifespan initiative. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of including older adults in clinical trials, as well as the ethics of including them in these trials?
I'll start with the ethics. The logic of including older adults is to assure that the results are generalizable to the people whom you're going to prescribe the treatment to. And so in the case of a vaccine for COVID, one constituency that's certainly going to want to use the vaccine, or you would hope would want to use the vaccine, are older adults. And so what you'd like are results from a clinical trial that says that it's effective and safe in that population. And so you want to design the study in a way that older adults will want to join it. You just don't want to get a couple older adults in it to boost the average age to 55 and say, see, you really want to make sure you've got a good representation so you can draw some conclusions. So what do you need to do? Well, people enroll in research for 3 reasons: trust, altruism, and some expectation of benefit. And if they feel that those things are reasonable, the risks and hassles and burdens of the research become reasonable. Well, what are the risks and hassles of enrolling in research? A lot of it's around the work of being a subject. The time and the travel, if you will, is one of the big featured downsides, if you will, being in research. Well, for older adults, time and travel are different than perhaps for a younger adult in terms of getting to the study site. So maybe home visits to do study visits would be useful. The perceived risks of traveling might be considered riskier right now at the time of COVID. So the point being that you can't simply just sort of take the average age of what is a 35-year-old face and assume that that's going to be the same profile of burdens and hassles as someone who's, say, 80, for whom matters of time and travel are a different calculus than they are for someone who's younger.
Great, thank you for that perspective. I love the trust, altruism, and benefit, kind of showcasing that as being important for older adults. Amy, with a perspective of how challenging it can be to understand the effect of vaccines and therapeutics in older adults, that gives us a new appreciation for the next part of the discussion, which is around the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. Can you tell us about what is in the pipeline and the process that is being followed for development of a COVID-19 vaccine?
Thanks, Kathleen. So just to start off, for those of you who are not familiar with BIO, or the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, we're a trade association representing biotechnology companies, academic institutions, state biotechnology centers, and other related organizations across the US and in 30 other countries as well. Our members work in human health, food and agriculture, and industrial and environmental biotechnology applications. And so really have been at the forefront of the COVID-19 research and development efforts. And so as Bio, we developed a COVID-19 pipeline tracker that looks at the vaccines and therapeutics that are in development. This is updated weekly and it's available for free on our website at bio.org/COVID pipeline tracker. We really just put this together, hoping it's a useful tool for researchers and physicians and other interested stakeholders who are really trying to stay on top of what is happening in the COVID space. So if we go to my first slide, as of Monday, October 19th, there were 759 products in development for COVID-19, and 25% of those, or 192 products, are vaccines. All of these trials for vaccines are in adults currently. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov, all of the vaccine trials, with the exception of Pfizer's, are 18 plus. Pfizer has now limited their or aged down their trial to 12 plus, but right now we are looking at adults, including those older adults in the pipeline. Next slide, please. The majority of the vaccine pipeline still is early preclinical work. We do have 17 in phase 1, 16 vaccines in phase 2, and 12 vaccines in phase 3. This is extraordinary, just given the time frame. If we think back to SARS in 2003, it took 20 months before there was a vaccine moved into the clinic. In this pandemic, we were able to move a vaccine into the clinic in just 3 months following the sequencing of the virus genome. So it's really is kind of a accelerated track, thanks in large part due to technologies and improvements over the last few decades in things such as virus sequencing. Additionally, the use of platforms in development means that we're not starting from scratch. There was work done on SARS and MERS, and even though we don't have vaccines for either of those diseases, we were able to take that research and translate it into COVID-19 R&D as well. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the clinical stage vaccine pipeline, and this has been accelerated in large part due to public and private partnerships. Those partnerships are de-risking research, manufacturing, and procurement. Operation Warp Speed here in the US has partnered with 8 companies for awards of upwards of $1 billion in order to try and have a vaccine tested by January 2021. You know, these investments really have compressed timelines by allowing companies to manufacture vaccines at risk while they're doing the R&D and help with the resources needed for recruitment into clinical trials, with phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 largely ongoing simultaneously. And then you'll see on the left side in the green text, there are a number of different technologies that are being applied to COVID-19 vaccines. And so we have some older platforms like the viral inactivated or recombinant protein that have been used as tried and true methods. And then we have some newer technologies like RNA and DNA vaccines that are really being really undergoing a trial by fire here with COVID-19, and their speed really is being shown in this pandemic, and we hope that in addition to the speed, they prove to be effective as well. Next slide, please. And then so this slide is pretty busy. It's a great resource that was developed by the folks at the Adult Vaccine Access Coalition to show the difference between standard vaccine development and what is happening during this pandemic to compress those timelines. As I already mentioned, compression is happening through parallel phases and the concurrent clinical development and manufacturing of vaccines. The manufacturing is happening at risk, so if these vaccines are not successful, they won't be used, but if they are successful, then we'll have a store of vaccines ready to go, the day after the FDA makes a decision that a vaccine can be used. In addition, FDA and NIH have been helping to streamline the process. NIH has developed a mechanism for streamlined clinical trial enrollment. So interested individuals can go to one website and sign up, and then their information is passed along to the trial investigators around the country. The FDA developed a master trial protocol so that individual companies don't have to negotiate terms of trials with the FDA. There is one protocol that is governing the trials. FDA is also undertaking rolling data reviews, so we don't have to wait until at the end of the phase for FDA to take a look at all of the data that's available. And then they also issued recently some guidance on the use of emergency use authorizations. And though that EUA guidance shows that there is a very high standard being upheld in the development and review of these vaccines. These COVID-19 vaccines are recruiting about the same number of trial participants as other vaccine trials. And so from a robustness of data standpoint, we can be pretty well assured that we're powering these studies to find out whether these vaccines truly are safe and effective. One gap that we will see initially is long-term safety data. FDA's EUA guidance did note that they would like to see at least 2 months of safety data following the last dose of a COVID vaccine. But typically a vaccine trial will have a year or so of safety data. And so there will be continued safety monitoring once a vaccine is authorized or approved, and we'll continue to learn more about these vaccines, but that will kind of be an initial gap. And in terms of safety monitoring, we are using existing systems like the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, as well as some new systems that are being developed specifically for COVID. And in terms of the trials process and review process, it's looking like an emergency use authorization is going to be most likely, at least initially. The goal of all the COVID-19 vaccines is to reach a biological license application eventually, but an EUA exists for these sorts of emergency situations where we can say that we have enough data to at least authorize the use of the vaccine in limited populations while we continue to gather more data. And so ACI, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, has been undergoing this prioritization exercise, and final decisions on prioritization will be made once we know which vaccines are actually authorized or approved and what their indication is in terms of age and other population demographics. But those activities are ongoing and underway right now. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for kind of laying out the different clinical trials that are taking place and the time frame in which they are currently in, and also laying out, the approval process. There's been so much in the news about this, and I think there's a lot of confusion, among the general public, as well as those of us who work in healthcare and in gerontology. So really appreciated all that detail on the approval process for these vaccines. And let's stay on the COVID-19 vaccines for just a bit. What do you think are the biggest challenges to developing, distributing, and administering a vaccine right now or in the near future, with the COVID-19 vaccine?
So there, I see this sort of three big things, and so one of them is getting people to say yes to getting the vaccine. There is this underlying current about, is the vaccine going to be trustworthy? Is it going to be safe? And I think we have to rely on our federal government to certify that these things are in fact safe enough, and in fact better than the alternative of getting the disease for the population as a whole. And I am sure we will have safe vaccines. It's just a question of when those vaccines are released, whether they've been in enough people to have confidence in that. So I would look to our leaders, Anthony Fauci and the CDC and the FDA, to tell us green light, get the vaccine. And one of the clues is if they're stepping up to get the vaccine for themselves, then I think that's a good sign that they wouldn't put themselves in harm's way, and they wouldn't put us in harm's way either. A second feature of this is some of these vaccines, especially the first ones to be available, likely the ones that are with messenger RNA, those vaccines have to be shipped in pretty cold. So getting the vaccine, we call this a cold chain, getting them to the site and keeping them frozen at the proper temperature isn't as easy as it sounds. So the doctor's offices might not have a -70 freezer like that's required for the Pfizer vaccine. So those kinds of delivery issues are going to be issues, and maybe it'll only be given at pharmacies. Nursing homes will have this issue too. Nursing homes and nursing home staff and residents are sort of priority one customers for these vaccines because of the high mortality there. So you'd want them to get the vaccines, but they still have to solve these delivery issues. The later vaccines, the ones that probably won't be ready for another 6 months or so, don't have the same kinds of delivery issues. The temperature that will be just like flu vaccine and the things that they've already solved for all sites. So it's a bigger challenge with the first vaccines. And I'm sure that as we get better with the science, they'll overcome those delivery issues, because that's a technical issue that doesn't involve the molecules. But there are things that they can do with the design of the molecules that might make them a little hardier. So getting warmed up won't be such a big deal.
Jason, would you like to comment?
So I think one of the biggest challenges acute right now that has been uniquely amplified in the last several months has been the politicization of the decision-making around vaccine review and approval. I think we've seen on the part of the executive branch, the administration, unusual meddling in public meddling in processes that have been set up to be apolitical and rely on science. When I reflect on that, I can become concerned that it undermines the public's trust that the system will make a decision that is based on the facts and the well-being of the American public. And if you don't trust the system, you won't participate in the system. And so I'm very worried that people will just simply not get the vaccine. And so the vaccine won't achieve what its goal is, which is herd immunity without killing people. Namely, the other part of herd immunity is just go out and get affected. And this is an approach that we hope is less risky. So if you don't have trust in a system, it's hard for a system to function. And I'm very worried that people simply just don't trust the FDA review process and feel that the decision will be politicized.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing some of that lack of trust in some of the surveys that have been conducted recently on uptake of the possible COVID-19 vaccines, over the next year or so.
Yeah, I mean, vaccines have a difficult history in America. The fact is, the vaccines aren't always uniformly effective. You get vaccinated and yet you still get the illness. Maybe not as bad as you would have gotten it, but you can still get it. And vaccines aren't without risks either. And so knowing that, to then add into that a sense of mistrust in the process that would approve this vaccine really is a setup for potentially a public health problem. Namely, the vaccine has some risks, isn't fully effective, and yet all of those risks are amplified, and if you will, in terms of the perception of the vaccine being unsafe and not effective. And so, we would like, I think Americans would like coherent messaging from the top that lets us believe in a system we've had in place around the review and approval of therapies. But it's been stressed and tested in the last several months in ways that are very frustrating by our president.
Absolutely. Amy, would you like to add to the comments?
Yeah, on the public confidence piece, as you have said, the numbers are lower than we would like to see in terms of the polling of people who are willing to get a COVID vaccine. And I definitely think that the politics surrounding the development process is one concern, but I also think that people are concerned about speed and they don't understand the vaccine development process to begin with and how things are normally done. And I think that there really is kind of an information deficit and information vacuum around COVID vaccines and their development. And, we really do need trusted sources to amplify and educate the messages around how things are normally done, what is different this time around, how we know that they're going to be tested and proven to be safe and effective. And, all of the data that I've seen before the pandemic and during the pandemic shows that providers really are, the most trusted voice for health information. And when you look at the numbers of healthcare providers who are expressing concern and doubt about a COVID-19 vaccine, it is really concerning that if those providers don't have confidence that these vaccines are being made in a scientifically rigorous and upright way, then their patients won't have that confidence either. And so I think that, there needs to be a lot done to educate the providers and then to educate the general public about these vaccines as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why discussions like these are so important to educate healthcare professionals. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit too about some of the challenges associated with distribution and administration of the vaccine? My understanding is that some of the first vaccines that may reach the market will require, possibly 2 doses, as well as, really stringent refrigeration requirements. Jason and Amy, you want to comment on those issues?
Yeah, so all of the vaccines that are furthest along in clinical development right now are 2 doses, and they are not interchangeable products. And so having that reminder recall and the systems in place that allow us to track who got what vaccine and when, and then have that follow-up, because not only are the vaccines not interchangeable, they have different dosing regimens. I think one is 21 days and one is follow-up at 28 days. And so each state has an immunization information system. Their capabilities and the ability of different providers and immunizers to input and access the information varies from state to state. And so, I think there's a lot that needs to be done before we have the vaccines to make sure that those systems are ready for the inputs that are coming their way. The Operation Warp Speed issued their guidance to states back in September for development of COVID-19 vaccine distribution plans. And those initial plans were due to CDC from the states on Friday, October 16th. And we'll continue to see refinement of the plans as we get closer to the campaign. But, I think one concern is that we have 50 states, there'll be 50 state plans. There's potential for inconsistencies in how these vaccines are going to be getting out to people. The different types of sites and cold chain requirements and those sorts of things will vary from state to state. And then, in addition, state health departments have really been stretched thin by the COVID-19 pandemic and their response. And so making sure that those state partners are resourced so that they are able to implement a COVID-19 vaccine campaign that is effective and, very smooth to the public, so that we don't have these hiccups that, can also undermine confidence because you went and thought you were getting a vaccine and couldn't get it that day because they ran out of supply and things like that. So I think that there's a lot of support that needs to go to the states as they are planning for the distribution in terms of, updating systems and bolstering the existing infrastructure.
And I would say the record since March of the federal government's efforts to create a coherent supply chain for things like personal protective equipment has not been commendable. And so one should be legitimately worried about the efforts to put together a coherent supply chain for the vaccine.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, let's now move and take a few minutes to highlight that we already have, several effective and very important vaccines for older adults. Stefan, can you talk to us about what these vaccines are? And then, Jason, if you could share a little bit about what you think are some lessons that we can learn from the current U.S. Vaccine program that may be able to be applied, as we move forward with the COVID-19 vaccine distribution.
Sure. There's a bunch of them out there, so I'll just give you the list of some of the vaccines that we give to older adults. Influenza vaccines, pneumococcal vaccines, tetanus vaccines, shingles vaccines, hepatitis vaccines. And now just a quick run through those. The influenza vaccine comes in a couple of flavors. It's a regular dose vaccine with 4 different antigens. It's called a quadrivalent. And then there's a version of this influenza vaccine that comes with an adjuvant. It's called Fluad. And there's a version of this comes as a quadruple dose. That's called high dose vaccine. And those 2 vaccines, Fluad and high dose, Fluzone high dose, are both specifically licensed for use in older adults. Then there is a recombinant vaccine. It's a triple dose vaccine that is not created in eggs. So it's an egg-free thing. And that is licensed for 18 and older. And that also seems to be better than the regular vaccine. So three vaccines that I would put in this enhanced vaccine category, 2 of which are specifically licensed for 65 and older. For the pneumococcal vaccines, it comes 90 pneumococcal strains that can cause the disease streptococcal pneumonia.
Hi there. Sure. Hi, this is Jason. I'm going to move my computer around the room to see my room, although I'm moving the microphone now away from my thing. You want to put up a background that's just blue?
I'll even unmute my mic. How's that?
It looks like I can't put up a virtual background.
Them to kids. And when the kids got these vaccines, they stopped having the bacteria that this vaccine protects in their nose where they're normally colonized. And so the really fascinating thing is those 7 strains in that initial 7-valent conjugate vaccine started disappearing among children, and before adults got it, the prevalence of the pneumonias and the bacteremias that were in adults also started going down for those same strains. After the 7-valent vaccine had been on the market for 10 years, it was starting, the next round was given to kids with 13. Then in 2014, they introduced that 13-valent vaccine to older adults, and it was just as effective. There was a question about whether it provided added benefit if the kids were already preventing an older adult. So when you vaccinate a child and they can't give it to anybody else because they were the place that it was spreading from, maybe you don't really have to give it to an older adult. Maybe they're protected okay anyhow. Because of that, the ACIP changed its recommendation where everybody over the 65 should be getting that conjugate vaccine. They said it should be with shared decision-making. And that means you talk about it with your doctor. Now, my personal opinion is added protection might be relevant, especially if you're a grandparent who has kids, and especially if you're in a household where the kids might not be vaccinated. So that's where the shared decision-making comes in. In nursing home, the risk is even higher because it's harder to have the conversation about which of the people who work in the facility have vaccinated their kids properly and might also be carrying it back into the facility. The science to say that they are a carve-out population where you should especially be considering this vaccine is still incomplete. So it hasn't made it yet to recommendations because of the lack of evidence, not because of the lack of known benefit. Finally, for the shingles vaccine, that changed to a recombinant vaccine and is highly effective. 90% or more will not get shingles because of this vaccine or the other sequelae. Even with a shingles infection, you can have heart attacks and strokes. Your risk goes up by 20 or 30% for the months that follow shingles. So if you can prevent shingles, you can probably prevent those. Like with the other vaccines, this is also true, like the flu vaccine. So getting vaccinated, staying protected is a great idea. The idea behind vaccines is if you can prevent the infection, then you can prevent the inflammation. And if you can prevent the inflammation, you should be able to prevent heart attacks. So the best data for preventing heart attacks is actually for flu. There's a couple dozen papers out there that says if you get a flu vaccine, you can reduce your risk for having a heart attack as much as you'd reduce it by quitting smoking or taking a cholesterol drug like a statin, as much as you could reduce your risk for heart attack by taking your blood pressure medications. So it's a really simple intervention to keep your heart healthy and not have something that might cripple you. There are now data out for shingles vaccine doing this also, and also shingles antivirals. So I think these data are still developing, but I think it turns out that getting vaccines in general may in fact give you this extra advantage beyond just preventing the infection, but these other non-targeted indications. So
Jason and Amy, if you could share what you think are some lessons learned from the current US vaccine distribution system that may be able to be applied to the COVID-19 vaccine as that gets rolled out.
So I'll start with just a quick point. If there's one vaccine that every year we have to take and every year makes a difference in the lives of older Americans, it's the influenza vaccine. And we've seen in the last several years increasing push by healthcare systems to mandate vaccination by all employees unless they can clearly show a medical exemption that prohibits getting the vaccination, as opposed to making it just something that's voluntary. That makes a lot of sense because older adults go to healthcare facilities frequently, and you'd like to make sure that the younger adults who take care of them are vaccinated against influenza. because quite frankly, well, they might get influenza and just have a bad couple days of not feeling well. Giving it to an older adult could be far more harmful to the older adult. What's encouraging is that the general-wide adoption and acceptance on the part of healthcare systems of mandatory vaccination. And so I think that we should have the same expectation, obviously, for COVID vaccination, about mandatory vaccination being just a simple expectation if you're going to work in a healthcare setting.
Yeah, and our adult vaccination rates lag behind those of pediatrics. With flu, adult vaccination rates tend to fluctuate between 40 and 60%. But for things like shingles, we were so happy when we met the Healthy People 2020 goal a few years back for shingles vaccination rate, but the goal was only 30%. So, I think that there's a long way to go in terms of increasing adult vaccination rates. But I think that one thing that has really been helpful in getting vaccines to adults is making the vaccines available in places that are convenient for their everyday life. So having pharmacy vaccination and having, people come into long-term care facilities to provide vaccination, reaching out to vaccination within the community and not just relying on provider offices, I think is something that is really important as we kind of try to innovate for a COVID-19 vaccination campaign. It can't just be people going to their doctor's offices. But flipping the question around a little bit, I was thinking about this and had a lot of ideas about what COVID can teach us for improving our immunization infrastructure kind of going forward. And I think that, there's a lot of innovation happening on the R&D side for these vaccines, and hopefully these platforms that we're testing in the pandemic will help us to go faster next time and to learn new things for bringing new, routine adult vaccines forward as well. Additionally, last September, the administration issued an executive order on modernizing influenza vaccines. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from COVID as we look to improve the flu vaccines that we have in terms of making it so they're more efficacious, as well as shortening the time frame that we need in order for strain selection to happen. And so we can be a little bit more precise about what strains are actually circulating and have that better match for flu vaccines in the future. And then something that we haven't really delved too much into today is the issues of equity. And we've seen, certain populations really hard hit by the COVID-19 COVID-19 pandemic. And it's really shown a light on the disparities that exist in American healthcare. And I think that there are some great partnerships that are being forged right now, and a lot of collaborations and work with the communities that are being hard hit. And I think that that is something that we can't walk away from once the pandemic ends. We need to continue to partner and collaborate with and listen to communities that have been historically left out of the healthcare system, and continue to work to overcome those disparities and work towards equity.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I think those are really, really important points, and around, the importance of partnership development as we try to reach, communities of color in particular who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And we're thinking a lot about that too at the National Council on Aging, and how we can, leverage the trust that senior centers, for example, have built up in communities, and how they might be able to partner with local health departments or their local pharmacies who are going to be administering the vaccines. So, and how we can leverage other partners that are trusted within communities of color, churches and other settings. I think that's going to be so important as the vaccines are rolled out. Absolutely. So thank you both for your comments around those issues. And yeah, it's been a really great discussion today. And I'd like to kind of end the conversation with asking each of you now to give us, a quick closing thought.
Thank you for that. And I completely agree with our other speakers that vaccinations are really an important piece of how we do prevention, and that COVID-19 is a big deal. You've seen that 40% of the mortality nationwide here, and worse in other countries, some states it's as high as 75% in nursing homes, means that we have to figure out how to stop this bug. Vaccines are really our only hope. And I think it's not just one vaccine, it's all of them, right? So you want to protect yourself from all the other things that could make the COVID infection worse. You want to reduce your risk for heart attacks, for example, by every means that you can. And so this trickles into when the COVID-19 vaccine becomes available. It's one more plate in your armor for this protection. It's better than wearing a seatbelt. It's like wearing 2 or 3 seatbelts when you do all of the vaccines together.
So COVID has been an awful natural experiment on America, meaning we didn't wish this, we didn't want it. And what it's done is exposed, though, a number of faults in our system. It exposed the fragile long-term care services and support system that we have. It showed how essential family caregivers are to the health and well-being of Americans. It showed how essential science is to our well-functioning country. It showed how important trust is so that science can work. And if you fracture trust, if you weaken it, you weaken the ability of science to function. Science is strong, but it actually is quite fragile. It relies on trust. And finally, it exposed the inequities in our economy and in our healthcare system. So it's my hope that people like Amy and Stefan and other scientists will solve this with the vaccine and other treatments. But it's also my hope that our leaders and our thinkers and our cultural leaders will help us overcome this as well. If we all don't work together, a known number of vaccines will solve this.
Thank you. Amy?
So my parting thought is, that as we've heard, the vaccine development process for COVID-19 vaccines is the same as we've seen for every other vaccine that we have. Scientific integrity is being upheld through transparency in FDA and CDC meetings and guidance. And then as an industry, leaders from the nine of the COVID-19 vaccine development companies have issued a pledge saying that they will not seek FDA review until after there is phase 3 data. And so despite all of the political talk surrounding the vaccine and the pressures, scientific rigor and integrity is being upheld, and industry is working to make sure that the products that are being brought to the American people are of a high standard and are very safe and effective.
Excellent.
Well, thank you, Stefan, Jason, and Amy for a wonderful discussion today. And thank you all for joining. And now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for listening in to our conversation today about vaccines among older adults. So now we're going to move on to the live Q&A portion of the session today. And we do have a number of questions that have been asked in our chat function. And I'd like to start with one regarding representation of seniors in clinical trials for the COVID vaccines. And I wonder, Amy, maybe we can start with you. If you could share what you know about the percentage of seniors in the trials.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't know kind of the exact percentage among the different trials. I do know that, older adults are a focus, given the epidemiology of the disease and the need to protect, all of those citizens who have been the hardest hit, including older adults. And so compared to previous vaccine trials, there definitely is an increase in the number and percentage of older adults. I think that is something that we could, potentially follow up with through GSA with some additional information on that, with more specifics.
Stefan or Jason, would you like to comment on that question from, what you've been learning about the trials?
Yeah, so just very briefly, these trials are typically aiming to recruit about 30,000 or more if they can in each of those cohorts. And my understanding is that the proportion of folks that are over the 60 is a small fraction of that. And that means that since we know that older adults respond less well to vaccine, and there's only a certain proportion that will be infected with COVID, that we're not likely to get any effectiveness data that is statistically meaningful in that subset of the population. We might get it for the population as a whole, but it'll be hard to know specifically if those older adults get protection. A second feature of that, I think in special populations like nursing homes, that those are even more underrepresented, if not entirely absent in these vaccine trials. It is really hard to recruit from that setting. Dr. Karlawish can talk about the issues around ethics and recruitment. It is a population that experiences the highest mortality, so should really be a premium target for vaccine studies, but really a difficult population to study.
Yeah, to pick up on Stefan's points, I think if we want data from individuals who are older, particularly residents of long-term care facilities, we're going to have to design recruitment and retention plans that acknowledge the very specific resources needed to do a study in those settings. And I think some obvious resources are to bring the study to the long-term care facility, to gather the data there, to do the recruitment there, to not at all expect individuals who want to participate to have to travel outside the facility. That's just going to have to be part of the budgeting and the design of the study to address those unique challenges of travel and participation. I don't see matters of consent actually as a barrier. They're a challenge because I would imagine there'll be some instances where proxy surrogate consent will be needed. But I think there's a well set out set of ethics guidelines to use proxy consent for a clinical trial that would be testing a vaccine. It doesn't strike me that the studies prima facie present research risks greater than minimal. The details, of course, would need to be worked out. But I think there's a viable way forward. We just have to have the will, the resolution, and frankly, the money resources to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really relates to one of the comments that came in as well around safety. And it's safety for whom is really an issue as well. And how do we learn about maybe some of the subpopulations who will be vaccinated with these new vaccines? And, as Amy described, we're going to learn more, through the 2-month period, but then post-marketing as well. Any comments on safety issues that you'd like to share?
Yeah, safety will obviously be a consideration that FDA and CDC take in their reviews of the data and their decisions on indications for different populations, including different age cohorts, and then the recommendations that are made by the ACIP. So, all of the companies are working to, recruit people so that the trial is representative. But as Stefan said, it may not be as representative as we would like. But those subpopulation analyses will be part of the data that is presented to FDA and CDC for the authorization and licensure and recommendation processes, and that will be, part of the consideration in terms of who it's recommended for.
Yeah, so just to add to that a little bit, I see safety in a couple of different ways. One of the questions has been with the people who have been sickest with COVID-19. This includes older adults in nursing homes. They have also produced the most antibody. And there is a underlying concern if that's if the antibody is somehow contributing to the disease, or if it's just a marker of better protection, from subsequent infection. So there's a phenomenon called antibody disease ADE, antibody disease effects. And so in a RSV vaccine trial back in the 60s, 69 to be more precise, they ended the trial because the people who were vaccinated actually had worse disease. I don't think it's likely to happen with this, but it's one of those things when you're thinking about safety signals, how do you find it? And how do you know? And we do know that with these vaccines, you can get substantially higher titers than you get with natural disease. So anyhow, so that's one side. The second aspect of this is if you're going in to vaccinate people in a nursing home, you're introducing potential vectors. Now that we're having 100,000 cases a day in the community, you worry about when you take a person out of the community to come in and do vaccines, if it can't be given by staff, are you potentially introducing vectors into the setting? So those are two things.
I think Stefan's made some interesting points, both biological as well as, frankly, I guess, social, cultural. Namely, the nursing home is an interesting setting. I mean, it's a concrete group of people who are sort of there and not moving about much, with then staff who are moving about a lot and then leaving and coming back. And actually, if you put some great minds together, like Stefan's and others, I think you've come up with a very interesting study, and valuable study, more importantly, to test a vaccine that respects the uniqueness of the nursing home setting in terms of the concentration of individuals and within a space, and the presence of staff coming in and out from rooms, et cetera, as well as leaving and going. And my wheels are sort of spinning, but I'm thinking it's a study that could yield some very valuable data around biology, transmission, in addition to the data around the actual efficacy of the vaccine, specific to a population that's been devastated by the virus.
Thank you all for your comments. We have just a few minutes left, but one of the questions that came in also relates to safety, and that is the safety of COVID vaccines with other vaccines, like the flu vaccine or the vaccine for shingles. Do we know?
I can start off again. We are starting some of those analysis of kind of the interplay between different vaccines. I think that COVID and flu are obviously kind of first on the list, since we'll probably be starting to administer COVID vaccines during this flu season and want to make sure that that is safe. Those studies that are looking at those interactions and how vaccines kind of work together or work against each other are ongoing. I don't have a whole lot of detail on that right now. I know that flu definitely is getting the most attention of the vaccines for older adults and COVID.
Any other comments? Okay.
Yeah, addressing the twindemic. And I just wanted to correct something I said a second ago. I talked about ADE, it's actually AED, antibody enhanced disease was the term I was looking for. With the twindemics, actually the flu vaccine uptake has been more than most seasons. Mm-hmm. And I thought that's actually interesting this year, because there's a lot of reasons for people to want to worry about going in and perhaps getting exposed, kind of like going to the elections to vote. But that hasn't quelled demand. If anything, the demand is much higher this year for the flu vaccine, which to me is very encouraging.
Well, thank you. Very encouraging. One last question, and that is, what's the status of vaccination pre-treatment with, say, something like Metformin to increase efficacy?
Can you repeat the question for me, please?
Yeah, it's the status of, do we know anything about pre-treatment with a medication like Metformin to increase efficacy of the vaccines?
So I haven't seen anything for that around COVID-19. I can tell you that we just published a paper with Metformin. People who are on Metformin seem to have less severe disease than those who are not. Metformin and other mTOR inhibitors So azithromycin and the macrolides are in that cluster. There's RTB101, which is an experimental drug that is an mTOR inhibitor. That cluster of drugs with that specific effect both have virus-specific inhibitors that they promote. They are considered anti-aging as a group, and they may have vaccine-enhancing effects. But to say whether, in fact, that boils through to something that's clinically relevant, we're far, far away from knowing that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I similarly am not familiar with any kind of pre-treatment studies, but a number of the vaccines do use adjuvants in order to boost the immune response.
Great. Well, thank you all, Stefan, Amy, and Jason. This has been a fantastic discussion, and we thank you all for joining us today. And I'm sure it's a discussion that will continue for many months to come, and at the next GSA conference for sure. So thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Enjoy the conference.